What are the 10 trades you need to make before your fantasy football trade deadline? We'll go over all of that in this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. The first trade that you should try to make, and these are not in any particular order, but the first trade you should try to make is to buy high on Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver George Pickens. With Russell Wilson under center, George Pickens is seeing a much higher average depth of target, and he's averaging almost 2 end zone looks per game. That's a much better role than what he was seeing with Justin Fields under center. Also, according to the Fantasy Life rest of season schedule ranking, the Steelers have the 5th best schedule the rest of the way for wide receivers. Pickens will see 2 games against the Ravens secondary and 2 games against the Browns secondaries that are both really easy to pick on, and then another game against a mediocre Bengals secondary. Yes, the Steelers are going to try to run the ball a lot still, so there won't be a high usage rate that can make Pickens a locked-in wide receiver 1, but with the usage that he is seeing and the schedule that he is seeing, I think Pickens is a high-end wide receiver 2, and I'd be looking to add him in whatever leagues I can. You should also look to buy high on San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Juwan Jennings. Now, Jennings did score 13 points in half PPR formats in Week 10, but I think there's a lot more in the tank here. We saw what this 49ers offense would look like with Christian McCaffrey back in the fold, and Jennings has a really enviable role in this offense. In Week 10, he led 49ers wide receivers with a 95% route participation rate, with a 25% target share, and with 34% of the team's air yards. In games without Brandon Ayuk this year, he has averaged a 32% target share, and Kyle Shanahan has said that this is the role Jennings is going to play for the rest of the season. To me, that makes Jennings a locked-in wide receiver 2 for the rest of the way, and so if the fantasy manager in your league who has him doesn't yet value him at that level, you might be able to get Jennings before he has another big week. The next trade you should try to make is to buy low on Tampa Bay Bucs wide receiver Mike Evans. Now, this has a lot to do with where you're at in the standings, but if you're in a pretty good spot for the playoffs and the fantasy manager in your league who has Evans really needs to win this week, I think you should try to make a deal for Evans right now. Evans has missed the last 3 weeks with a knee injury, and the Bucs are on bye right now, so he's going to get no production. However, when he comes back, he gets games against the Panthers, Giants, and Raiders. And those are all games that we think Evans should really have the potential to have blow-up opportunities in. If the fantasy manager in your league who has Evans really needs a win right now, you could take a hit on the production in your lineup and trade a startable wide receiver, somebody with a good week right now, to that fantasy manager to get Evans. You'll take a hit, you'll give that fantasy manager much needed production this week, and then you'll get to reap the rewards of Evans for the weeks to come. Obviously, this is league specific and this is standing specific, but again, if you're in a position where you can make that move and take the hit on Evans this week, I'd be looking to do that. The next trade recommendation is to buy low or sell high on Dallas Cowboys wide receiver CeeDee Lamb. I know that's a bit confusing, but it depends on if you have CeeDee Lamb or not in your leagues. The Dallas Cowboys offense with Cooper Rush looked pretty terrible, and there's a lot of panic going around, and that panic may have settled in on the fantasy manager in the league who has CeeDee Lamb. Lamb had just 5.4 fantasy points in half PPR scoring this week and 12.2 fantasy points last week in the game that Dak Prescott got hurt. So there is some panic that CeeDee Lamb is not the locked-in wide receiver 1 people drafted him to be. However, Lamb also had a 33% target share in Week 10. Since 2022, in the games that Dak Prescott has played, Lamb is averaging 20.7 fantasy points per game. And in the games that Dak Prescott has not played, Lamb is averaging 15.8 fantasy points per game. So 16 fantasy points per game still makes Lamb kind of a low-end wide receiver 1 in fantasy. So if you have Lamb, and you can trade him for a locked-in wide receiver 1, knowing that Lamb is now kind of a low-end wide receiver 1, I'd be looking to make that deal and trade away Lamb. However, if you do not have CeeDee Lamb and the fantasy manager in your league is panicking and thinks that Lamb's value is torpedoed, and you can get Lamb for a fair price for a low-end wide receiver 1, I'd be looking to float those offers. I think that if we adjust the calculations to assume Lamb is a low-end wide receiver 1 and proceed accordingly, you can either sell him or trade him depending on if you have him in your league. The fifth trade recommendation is to buy low on all of the Bears wide receivers. That's DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, Keenan Allen. And yes, this is 100% because on Tuesday morning, the Bears fired offensive coordinator Shane Waldron. This offense was a mess. The Bears were third worst in passing yards per game. None of these guys could get any consistent production. Now, a little bit of this has to do with the offensive line being injured and sloppy, but these are all talented wide receivers. We know that Caleb Williams has ability, so this is all just a risk on saying the Bears offense can't get any worse. It might get better with somebody else calling the shots. And so if you can get a low-cost share of any of these three wide receivers in the hopes that the Bears offense turns itself around or one of these guys becomes the featured weapon in the receiving game the rest of the way, that could be a gamble I'm willing to take. Before I get to the rest of my trade recommendations, pause this video, comment below. Let me know who you're looking to trade for or trade away, or ask me any start-sit questions, and I'll answer those as the week goes on. The next recommendation is to see what you can get in trading away Jaguars wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. Now, Brian Thomas Jr. is a really good wide receiver, so you're not cutting him and you're not forcing yourself to get rid of him. However, there are two things working against him right now. The first is that Brian Thomas Jr. is not playing healthy. We know he's playing through an injury. He hasn't had a 15% target share in either of the last 3 weeks, so that is a little bit of a concern. The second concern is that there's a shot that the Jaguars shut down Trevor Lawrence because of his shoulder injury, and Brian Thomas Jr. will be catching passes from Mac Jones the rest of the way. That could torpedo his fantasy value. Brian Thomas Jr. is running a route on 93% of dropbacks, so we do love that, which is why we don't want to just give him away. However, he has now fallen into a little bit more of a boom-bust wide receiver 3 category, and so if you can get somebody more stable for him, I would look to see what his value is in your league right now. You should also see what you could get if you trade away Tony Pollard. We thought that Tony Pollard might be the bell cow in Tennessee. However, Tyjae Spears came back in Week 10 and really muddled up the usage in the backfield. In Week 10, Spears handled 39% of the rushes. He played on 47% of the snaps, and he ran a route on 42% of the dropbacks. What's worse is Spears handled that's 100% of the long down and distance snaps, which means Spears is going to be on the field a lot in obvious passing situations if the Titans are trailing, needing to make up a lot of points on the scoreboard. And that could be what we see a lot going forward. So again, you're not giving away Tony Pollard. He still has looked good, and he still is the 1A in this committee. However, Spears has really muddled the situation a little bit. And so if you can get a solid RB2 for Pollard, I'd be looking to deal him away right now. I would also explore trading away Eagles wide receiver Devonta Smith. In games where A.J. Brown is healthy, Devonta Smith is averaging 11 fantasy points per game. That's not really strong production, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Eagles have gone really run-heavy with Saquon Barkley now in the fold. The Eagles are averaging under 200 yards passing. Their passing yards over expectation is among the lowest in the NFL. And so Devonta Smith having a 20% target share in an offense that doesn't even hit 200 yards passing makes him kind of a wide receiver 3, but I think the Eagles are still a trendy team, and Smith has a name value that you could maybe get a wide receiver 2 in a trade for him. I would be looking to buy shares of Tennessee Titans wide receiver Calvin Ridley. In the games without DeAndre Hopkins, Ridley is averaging a 36% target share. Now, all those targets are not the most efficient, but he is getting deep shots down the field, which means he only needs 1 or 2 of those to hit in order for him to have a big fantasy day. We've seen that play out over the last 3 weeks. In half PPR scoring, Calvin Ridley ranks 5th amongst all wide receivers in scoring over the last 3 weeks, and that includes a game in Week 9 where he had just 5.5 fantasy points. So he is a boom or bust wide receiver, but I think he's a high-end wide receiver 3, and those boom weeks are going to make him a wide receiver 1. So if the fantasy manager in your league who has Ridley just can't handle that headache or thinks that he's in for a really weak production with Will Levis under center, I'd be looking to buy a share of Calvin Ridley because I think those boom weeks are going to help you if you can just stomach the fact that he might also get you 3 points in a game where you really need production out of him. The last trade recommendation is to buy low on Giants wide receiver Malik Nabers. People hate Daniel Jones. People hate the Giants offense right now. Anything that the Giants touch seems to kind of have a stain on it. And so I think the fantasy manager in your league who has Malik Nabers may be trying to get out of the Malik Nabers business. He's averaged only 12 points per game over the last month. So his fantasy managers are not happy, and now the Giants are on bye, so they may just want to get any kind of production in their lineup instead of having Malik Nabers. However, over that last month, Nabers is averaging a 34% target share and 45% of the team's air yards. So we really love that role. That is the role of a wide receiver 1. So maybe Nabers is a low-end wide receiver 1 if they keep Daniel Jones under center. But if the Giants go to Drew Lock at quarterback, Drew Lock is a gunslinger. He's going to make some terrible throws, but he's going to push the ball down the field. He's not nearly as conservative as Daniel Jones. And so you could see a bump for the Giants pass catchers the same way the Cleveland Browns pass catchers got a bump with Jameis Winston under center. Winston's going to throw picks, but he's going to lead to big plays. And so maybe Drew Lock will do the same thing for the Giants offense. And so I'd be trying to see if you can get a low-cost share of Malik Nabers right now. That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. As a reminder, hit the button below to like and subscribe to get all of our fantasy football content at NBC Sports for the rest of the way. And I'll see you next week for another episode of the Fantasy Football Trade Desk. Happy trading.